This episode could be for two different types of writers. Maybe you're actually a really good writer. You're confident in your writing, you know how to turn a phrase, or maybe you're writing your memoir and worried about not being a good enough writer. Most of my clients fall into one of these two camps. So what I'm going into in today's episode is going to ask you to examine your writing in a new way, because the truth is that just because something is well written doesn't automatically make it interesting. Today, we're going deep into the nuances behind both a good memoir and one that is well written. So let's get started.
You are listening to the Memoir Method podcast, the place for writers, readers, and anyone who appreciates the collective power of our stories. In this podcast, we explore the impact of memoir alongside an examination of writing techniques and strategies used in the genre. Whether you are a writer looking for inspiration and guidance or a passionate reader seeking meaningful connections through shared experiences, the Memoir Method podcast is your go-to conversation spot. I'm your host, Charlotte, editor, writer, and the heart behind Charlotte Writes. Let's get started.
So first off, boring is a highly subjective term. I realize that. So before we get into the meat of this episode, I want to define what I mean by a boring memoir. When I am bored by a story, nonfiction or otherwise, I don't really care how it ends. I feel ambivalent about it. I will feel sympathy without being emotionally invested myself. I'll read the story and think, that's good for her, or that's too bad, without feeling a pull to examine how this could impact my own life or why what happened actually mattered in a bigger scope. Or maybe it's a story that I can't find much to talk about and I don't really think about it again. I know that writers, we can be afraid of someone hating what we write or not liking it, but that to me is better than someone who reads and says, it's fine. You want your writing to elicit an emotional response. You would rather it not be a negative emotional response, but I think that is much more indicative of how compelling and interesting your conversation is, your memoir is, than a story where you read it and you're like, all right, that's not what we want. When I'm evaluating a memoir manuscript for a client, there will always be chapters that bore me. This happens every time. It's not personal. And that honestly is my cue as an editing professional to pay attention and take note so that we can rework that in revisions. I'm always paying attention to what isn't working and running through my brain reasons why, so that we can actually address it in revisions later. And when I meet with writers, they're often very concerned about being a good writer. I mentioned this last week as well. Many of my clients had never considered themselves writers before starting their memoir. And understandably, you might be worried about the talent side of writing. I'll slide something in here that maybe not every editor or publishing professional would agree with. And maybe this should be its own podcast episode altogether. But I don't think that innate talent is as valuable or necessary as we think it is. What I care about more is whether you are having a conversation with your memoir and how you are telling your story. I can teach you all about how to write a scene, how to write characters, when to show and when to tell, all of the nuts and bolts of sound writing. But none of that matters if you don't know what you want that writing to say. A boring memoir is one where the reader is going to ask themselves, so what? As the author, I actually teach my writers how to ask themselves, so what? So that your reader doesn't have to. I've said this a million times in this podcast and to my clients, and I will keep saying it. Your reader doesn't care about what happened to you. They care about what you did with what happened to you. That matters more than your raw writing talent every time. Not too long ago, I was evaluating a memoir manuscript for a client, and I was stunned by his prose. This man knew how to write a scene. I was immersed in the physical sensations of his story, but I didn't feel anything beyond that. My emotions were not activated. As we went into the work together, I asked him one question. What do you want the reader to get out of this? And his first reaction was to freeze. He knew the meaning. He knew why he wanted to write. He could feel it in the creative centers of his brain and his heart, but he couldn't yet articulate what he wanted his reader to feel. And side note, you don't want your reader to feel sorry for you. That is so surface level. That's so superficial. That is not what you want. You want to engage your reader's emotions and their thoughts. Sometimes when I ask a writer that question, what do you want the reader to get out of this? I can almost see a light bulb click on over their head. But in this case, it was more like a Charlie Brown rain cloud. Because it's one thing to know why you care about something and hold that transformation in a special place. And it's another to communicate that in a way where a reader can find their own meaning and willingly invest their own emotions. That's why this foundational work is always what I do first with my clients. We do that before we ever dig into the actual work, to the actual manuscript. This specific writer is actually part of the winter cohort of the Memoir method, and the thesis that he has articulated is so much more refined and dialed in than it was when I first read his manuscript several months ago. So let's go into writing a memoir that isn't boring. A memoir is not an autobiography, it's not a journal. And I know that you know this, and it does bear repeating. You are writing for a reader. Maybe I should do another podcast episode or a training about differences between memoir and autobiography. I know some people get confused about that. Your memoir is not an autobiography. You are writing for a reader. You want them to care. If you write your draft without a defined reader perspective or experience, your scenes risk feeling disconnected. Beautiful prose can ring hollow, and the narrative won't have much cohesion to it. It'll be really easy for the reader to find off-ramps, and they won't want to get back on. What I do in my spaces with my writers is reader-focused storytelling. You don't just want to finish your manuscript, you want to publish it. And no matter how you publish, traditionally or independently, your book will not sell if you don't know who you are writing for. What you need to do is take your story and dig underneath it to find the conversation that comes out of your experience. Let's break this down even further. So this client I'm talking about, he's an excellent writer. Once I took in the big picture of his story, we got to zoom out together before zooming back in. So I want you to ask yourself, what experience do I want my reader to have? How do I want them to feel? And what existing conversation is my memoir already a part of? Once my client could answer those questions, he actually expanded his timeline, he refined his scenes, and he threaded this deeper meaning and message throughout all of it. Once you know the deeper message of your story and why it's going to resonate with your reader, your writing is going to become magnetic instead of just pretty. And if your writing style and prose style needs some elevation, it needs some refinement, then you can be positive that as you are becoming a better writer, that writing is also connecting with the reader instead of just being a pretty sentence. A memoir is only boring when you haven't figured out how you want to use it to connect with your reader. And this is exactly why I created a new free resource for you, the Magnetic Memoir Prompts. This is an easily digestible resource with a 10-minute audio activation accompanying 3 very specific and guided prompts to help you figure out what lights you up, what conversation you're actually having, and why your reader also might care about this conversation. In these prompts, I actually won't have you going into your manuscript, but that's kind of the point. What happens for so many of you is that you're losing the forest for the trees. And this big picture work, truly, it's the first phase of a developmental edit, really. It's not busy work. This is essential clarity work. Head to the link in the show notes for instant access to your magnetic memoir prompts. I will send them straight to your inbox. And you can also find me on Instagram at the.memoir.coach and DM me about your memoir, and we can troubleshoot together, and I can help you figure out what would be a good entry point for you into my space, into ways that will actually help you. So it truly doesn't matter if you've always called yourself a writer or if the term writer is completely new to your identity, if that is something that you're easing your way into. You get to be a writer if you want to be. And you can always improve your writing. You can always learn how to be a good writer. To write a memoir that isn't boring and is also well written, you get to first decide what your story is actually saying. That's what will make your writing magnetic and your prose style shine. So remember, you can head to the show notes to access the Magnetic Memoir Prompts. Also, if you want to be notified when the Memoir Method Spring Cohort is open for enrollment, I will include the link to join the waitlist in the show notes as well. Thank you so much for joining me. I am obsessed with helping you figure out your story, and I will see you next week.
You've just listened to an episode of the Memoir Method podcast. The Memoir Method podcast is presented by Charlotte Writes. If you liked what you heard, the best way to support the show is to subscribe through your preferred podcast player. And if you're feeling especially inspired, I'd love it if you left a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Leaving a review really does help other readers and writers like yourself find the show. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find me on my website at charlottewrites.co or on Instagram at charlottejanewrites_. Thank you for tuning in. I'll see you next time, and remember that you have a story that matters.